first exposure to Mr. Lin-Manuel Miranda was back in 2015 when me, my mom, and pops went to the Aurora Theater to witness the play In the Heights, his very first theater production that he supplied the music and lyrics for. I absolutely fell in love with the exciting set and choreography paired with excellent acting, simplicity by vibrant color and production design, and the infectious energy it displayed through its rather extensive 2 acts while making sure its audience never lost interest. So much so that I'm hoping the eventual movie version that comes next year lives up to its counterpart's roots. Now, what I didn't know was that around the time I saw In the Heights, Lin released his second Broadway stage production, Hamilton, a musical following founding father Alexander Hamilton based on the 2004 biography book that used hip-hop to depict the life and legacy of Hamilton in a way people have expressed they haven't seen on stage before. Now, I normally take those words with a grain of salt, but I won't delay the inevitable much longer. If you told me 5 years ago that a bloody 5-year-old Broadway musical stage production play, amongst everything else, will go on to eventually become one of, if not the best film 2020 had to offer, I'm pretty sure my reaction would have been somewhere along the lines of, "You must be out of your goddamn mind!" However, my initial reaction after seeing it for the first time spoke all the words that I need to say about this masterpiece. But I'm still gonna try and dissect my feelings as unbiased as I can allow myself to, because goddamn it, I enjoyed this way too much!
I don't know much about theater or much about Broadway because it's not really my cup of tea, but if I had to say anything, I would just say that for me, for somebody who prefers cinema, films like the ones we watch, Hamilton was eloquent. To get somebody like me to watch a musical and enjoy it takes a lot. So I was pleasantly surprised at just how good this was and how many audiences it appeals to.
One thing my parents have informed me about when it comes to doing my own reviews on movies is to do extensive background research on whatever I'm watching so I can at least get the full idea as to what to expect when I do watch something. And luckily I did just that. Based on the 2004 autobiography on Hamilton's life by Ron Chernow, it goes through his arrival to New York City in 1776, his work in the Continental Army as the right-hand man to George Washington during the American Revolution, and how he met and married Elizabeth Schuyler in the first act. In the finale of the first act going into the second, it dissects his eroding friendship with Erin Burr, sir, his rivalry with Thomas Jefferson while being honed as the first Secretary of the Treasury, his affair with Maria Reynolds, the death of his son, the death of his political career, the momentary collapse of his marriage, and finally his own death in a duel with Erin Burr. I also just so happened to delve into Hamilton during U.S. history in college, delving past discussions of federalism, the first real split over the federal government versus state rights, why Hamilton felt the bank was necessary, and why the Southerners felt it would force the U.S. into economic situations where politicians would make decisions best for themselves instead of the country as a whole. Yeah, there's no question that Hamilton's history has been one of triumphs and tribulations, travesty, and a buttload of conflicting complications for both him and the United States as a whole, most of which the musical managed to capture and illustrate beautifully. So what exactly is it about this musical turned film production that has electrified and opened the eyes of so many people for the past 5 years? Acting-wise, it practically speaks for itself. If you don't count the ensemble, the musical has only 10 main actors and actresses in it, and every single one of them poured their blood, sweat, tears, and literal spit into making their adapted characters as memorable as possible.
You have to give a lot of credit to these people who were doing it for a year straight and kept that sort of enthusiasm and that vibe and that mood to always do it as if they were doing it for the first time.
As far as the ones who don't get enough credit, Christopher Jackson is the first that comes to mind. With all the other Hamilton productions I've picked out recently, no actor even comes close to his performance as Washington. Not only the acting and the singing, but the way he carries himself on stage makes you believe that he is a veteran military officer. I also think people sleep on Chiwetel Ejiofor. He played 2 drastically different characters effortlessly, one with amazing energy and force as Mulligan, and the other with deadpan humor as Madison. He doesn't really get a whole lot of credit, especially with his beatboxing. And then there's Jasmine Sophia Jones, who is criminally underrated in every sense of the word, given she hits her notes with such emotion and vigor, yet both of her characters aren't even the main highlights throughout the play, despite only one of them having a main thread that moved the entire crux of this real-life story around. Seriously though, Peggy deserves more respect, y'all. Now, some people are going to argue that Anthony Ramos is the same case, but given that both of his characters actually are important to Hamilton's narrative, he gets a pass here. Now for the well-known actors of the bunch. I was not expecting Lin-Manuel Miranda himself to be behind the character of Hamilton, let alone portray him with this amount of gravitas, relentless energy, and sly charm. He's constantly surrounded by other Black and Latino actors who outshine him constantly, and yet Lin marks the central character as one of the most ambitious and vocally important presences in the entire play. Bernice Elise Goldberry carries a bucket load of chemistry and charisma, immediately making Angelica one of the more prominent roles going into the story. David Diggs added a well-executed dose of suave and flair to both Lafayette and Jefferson, and can somebody please give Jonathan Groff an Oscar already? He was responsible for about 80% of the laughs in this entire musical, from his brief little glances and mannerisms and how his attitude slowly deteriorates quickly in all 3 of his brief appearances. He quickly became one of the more prominent favorite characters in the entire play, mostly due to how he's written. But perched at the very top of the mountain, it's Phyllis Sue and Leslie Odom Jr. who give out the best performances and are arguably given the best characters. I'll get to them soon. There's something about the camera work and the editing here that helps capture the look and feel of the Broadway version while still giving it a distinct personality within the realms of film itself, and I have to give Thomas Kail a good chunk of the credit for that. He captures the stage shows and infectious energy to such a marvelous degree thanks to his direction, which uses his close-ups judicially, but the editing manages to keep this level of intimacy grounded even when we're able to see the entire stage and all its performers. The intimacy of Kail's camera works wonders here. The emotion on the actors' faces as they sing are so lovely embraced, especially when they're pouring out their hearts. What I really like here, though, is that while I want to treat this like a film, I'm always aware that this is a live production filmed with an enthusiastic audience. There's applause after every number, and in wide shots that capture the turntable portions of the set, we can occasionally see the audience in the orchestra pit. Speaking of which, in June 2016, they spent at least $10 million to capture the show, with live audiences on Sunday and Tuesday, and then spent the rest of Sunday night and all day morning doing close-ups and crane shots to augment the action. And all of this was about a month before the original cast started leaving the show, and right after the show already won 11 Tony Awards. Now, this is enough to add that truly distinct and welcome "you are there" feeling to the proceedings. To be honest though, actually being there would have made this experience twice as delicious, but I digress. Speaking of the set, it's rare that a play, in my experience at least, ever got praised for the utter lack of movement in the set design. Now, I know that's possibly a dumb thing for me to say because it's pretty much a constant occurrence in a lot of other musicals, but this is a rare occurrence because it's very special. It is extremely limited to a fault, and somehow it simultaneously condensed everything needed to make it unique and highly versatile. Believe me, my jaw dropped down to the floor the first time it was utilized and satisfied via, again, the rotating turntable.
That
The entire sequence!
That's just beautiful. Oh my goodness.
Last I heard, they spent like a combined 68 hours recapturing every movement. I mean, look at this.
That right there is just poetic. I mean, it's the aesthetic. And look at Angelica's face too. It's kind of, it was just, she was thinking, yeah.
Upon utilizing the lack of space to set up the imagery for the events fantastically, the audience in a way can envision the events occur like they would play out in real life. Granted, that's one of the many purposes of a play anyways, but the overall structure of the 2 acts with this much versatility would have utterly been mucked up had the pacing been inconsistent at any moment, so thank God for that too. And then we get to the actual songs. Without having to dive into the story of each of them, they are hands down the best aspect of the musical without, the story. Granted, again, it's a musical and the entire purpose is to use whatever style becomes available to best fit the story, but also make the audience sing along. But literally every single song in this musical is fire! It's kind of difficult when you master rapping a rap god, and then you have to go through Godzilla, and then you can't get satisfied. Yeah. The idea to use rap as both a tool and voice of expression due to the power of its words and quick-wittedness in a meta-sense was genius by Lin-Manuel Miranda. Since almost every word in the musical is sung, it's a lot of fun discovering what combination of rap, R&B, gospel, and power ballad he will employ. He effortlessly changes gears when he wants to reach for the larger emotional moments that resonate all the way to the back of the theater, and while some songs are perfectly fine on their own without this style, the ones that do utilize it are the most memorable. You take Hamilton, Lafayette, Mulligan, and even Angelica for that instance. Most of their songs involve a lot of witty wordplay and multiple syllabic rhymes that further illustrate and dive deep into their psyches as people in the intellectual fields. Eliza and Maria and, to a lesser extent, King George are the only ones who don't rap, but their style of music already gives a different emotional mindset as to who they are and who they were as people. And because of all the diverse musical styles that play unto each other and constantly call back to one another, every song is going to get stuck inside of your head at some point. That right there is a guaranteed certainty. It's going to happen. And if that doesn't ring true,
you'll be back.
It's just so funny because I saw this one post the other day that said only Lin-Manuel Miranda can fit words like peach fuzz or eloquent or these just crazy words into a Broadway musical so perfectly. And I think people really underestimate the lyrics in this musical also and just how difficult it was to rhyme these things to where it makes sense.
Choreography also plays a big contributing factor into these songs working as well, slowing down the pacing and picking it back up whenever it's called for, and more or less doing it in style thanks to said strong Tony Award winning choreography by Andy Blake and Bugler. And oh, goody goody gumdrops, here we are, possibly my favorite part of this movie or musical or whatever you want to call it, the gargantuan hurricane of a story. No pun intended. The odd thing about this is because of my recent obsession with politics, I was able to get the gist of almost everything the movie was trying to say. It is more or less of a plot that eventually becomes the collective narrative of a nation built by immigrants who occasionally needed to be reminded about where they came from. It's overly uplifting, but at the same time very shrewd about the dark repercussions of patriotism and its own presentational contradictions, constantly inviting the audience to think about the ways in which our modern political problems regarding equality and inclusion have stemmed from the embedded failures of the historical ones, said issues of which are still heavily present within what's happening in our world right now, and especially in 2020. Hell, the very timing of this release, it continues to put the musical in conversation with current events, specifically the recent spate of stories of people of color being delegitimized or completely left out of boardrooms, writers' rooms, and other places where decisions were made. It's a feeling of revelation that most of the characters are forced to come face to face with the longer the story progresses, and the more I began to watch this culturally enriching experience on repeat, the more I began to dissect the power behind the musical's choice of words and its motifs, as well as the emotional paradoxes it creates behind the plot. Miranda, being the great writer he is, took advantage of the endless number of motifs in the musical, let alone what it could do emotionally, and showed us, rather than tell us, how much we, the audience, evolved throughout the entire course of this journey, because that's what motifs are supposed to do. But, let us illustrate a little further here. The other characters are more or less straightforward.
Yeah, you kind of have to feel bad for Peggy sometimes. I don't know if you noticed, but in Satisfied, like you notice that Angelica just grabs her by the arm and she smiles a little bit. But you can tell that she's kind of bummed out that she doesn't have the relationship that her sisters have. So Peggy was always kind of like the outcast or the outsider, kind of growing up with Angelica and Eliza. Angelica had her wits and her smarts and her sass, and then Eliza had her beauty, you know, and Peggy was just, we don't really know anything about her, except from the fact that she was just this goody two-shoes who wanted to do what her dad told her to do.
Angelica Sparta connects with Hamilton, but sacrificed him, leaving her bitter and unsatisfied. Philip paid the price for inheriting his father's hot-headedness. Lawrence lost his life for freedom and a senseless act, stuff like that, you know? Alexander Hamilton, in some ways I can understand why some people would consider him to be your profound definition of a tragic character, both in the musical and in real life. The musical doesn't capture every up and down about his life, but it lets us in more than enough about him to not put him on a pedestal or make him the epitome of hatred. It paints him as a rounded person with mistakes, regrets, and achievements just like everyone else, and he is constantly dragged to hell and back for almost every decision he makes. Early on in his life, he met death in the face in the eye of a hurricane and survived, but wished for another opportunity to dance with death once again, because ever since he was 14, he was ready to die. It didn't faze him anymore. In early life, Alex lived on taking risk after opportunity after opportunity he saw, even after he matured and slowly focused on making something that would outlive him, hence the motif, my shot. He went on living his life the only way he knew how, dedicating himself to writing. But that same dedication that built up his legacy also tore down the respective barriers between his friends, his family, and ultimately his career. The entire 2 acts highlights his tactic for being insufferable at an all-time high, either letting his frustration or anger get the better of him, or using other people's words against him as long as it meant he didn't have to throw away his shot. And then there's,
Lafayette.
Lafayette denied.
He's like, this one's mine.
Nope. Regardless, all of that eventually led to his downfall when he eventually cheats on Eliza, and Eliza burned his communications to her. And guess what he does next? He gets his own son killed. But then, that moment right there, in It's Quiet Uptown, that's the closest that we ever get to Hamilton actually going through some legitimate change. It's the only time in his life where he actually gives up his words and embraces the quiet, because words fails him. In real life, he didn't really write anything for the next 4 to 6 months or whatever, and he actually had to be held up a couple of times during the funeral because he was collapsing too much. He was left wallowing in his own self-pity, realizing that there was no reversing this. He didn't bother asking for forgiveness. And yet, he was forgiven anyways. His friend/rival Erin Burr proves to be his total opposite from literally the very beginning of the play. His motif, wait for it, also the best motif in the entire play, expresses a desire to basically wait for it. He's been well aware that people jump headfirst into the fire and don't come out the same way, so he promised that whenever an opportunity came his way, if he was patient enough, he would earn his place. Since he and Hamilton were friends, albeit not close ones, I imagined him more like a mirror that reflects Hamilton's life and character development. But if you really think about it, it's relatable as to why he began feeling resentment towards Hamilton. I mean, whenever he does anything that Hamilton has a problem with or is critical of, he always has to get in his face and make a big scene. But the thing is that once he does it again and Burr finally reveals what he wants, that's when he starts going against his own belief and the problem starts. He stops appreciating himself and starts comparing himself to Hamilton, catching on to his rashness, his relentlessness from his younger years, scrambling after power and prestige by finally committing himself to the principle and taking risks. And the irony in all that?
Jefferson has my vote.
Not even that works. I mean, sure, Burr did get the vice presidency in real life, but the fact that he doesn't here, it essentially makes him out to be the only Shakespearean figure in this pageant, a gifted man tormented and ultimately undone by his desperate failure to make himself matter at the expense of someone he grew increasingly jealous of. Another such motif is the counting of the numbers from the 10 Dual Commandments to little Philip playing the piano and him not catching the rest of the numbers and eventually dying. Another one is the actress who plays the Bullet, Ariana Bois. She's the first person we see die in the play, and from then on, she's sort of like an omen of death. She hands Hamilton the quill he uses in Your Obedient Servant, Philip flirts with her and blow us all away, literally flirting with death, and she's the last person seen with Lawrence in Yorktown. Then, of course, there's like every other infectious son that comes back around to either support a character or bite them in the ass. Seriously, every character has at least one musical motif that further develops and changes the meaning as the play progresses. Looking back upon the film now, this helps set up every character to have somewhat of a complex dynamic that mirrored their real-life counterparts, because like Len himself said, no person in this musical is a saint. Hamilton was widely outspoken due to his ignorance, arrogance, and hot-headed temperament, and his affair with Mariah Reynolds didn't really help matters. Washington stepped down when his country arguably needed him the most. Jefferson was a flagrant racist and bigoted hypocrite. Phillips insisting on defending his father's legacy, reflected the worst of his father's traits onto him. The list goes on and on. If anything, if I look back on this, it makes me realize that Eliza's the only one who actually had the most wholesome arc. Naive and helpless at first, her intention on sitting on the sidelines and go along for the ride with others would do her no good, despite a deeper appreciation for the little things in life, given her husband's betrayal. In the second act, she decides that she does not want other stories and mistakes to define her, so she puts herself in control of her own story by the middle and end. In short, she goes from being a passive sidekick-like character to an influential leader who chooses to control her narrative but understands that it's ultimately up to history to determine whether she has created a legacy. She's more or less the underdog of this entire thing, despite Burr being the only three-dimensional character here. Not only that, but I also thought the show within itself is pretty meta in discussing its own inaccuracies to the real-life events. From Eliza
erasing myself from the narrative
as a blunt way of saying that we have no idea how she reacted, to Burr singing about how
No one else was in the room where it happened.
explicitly describing the motive assigned to Hamilton giving up the capital for the banks and speculation, and even the own show's obsession with legacy and how we'll be remembered is all around pretty meta amongst other things, since this play is literally the legacy of Hamilton now, and we are currently remembering the events through a lens, unless you want to look at the book this play is based off of, so in that case you have two lenses to look through. And those lenses speak out wholly towards the tale of two men harkening back to and questioning the rotating hands of fate, and like the great Moritz once ushered,
fate, it seems, is not without a sense of irony.
Alexander not only grew cautious and self-aware in his older years, the very traits that once defied Burr, but also eventually grew to doubt his own obsession with legacy, and with it, his never-ending battle trying to outlast time. Burr, adapting Hamilton's recklessness and relentlessness to get into the room where it happens, doesn't wait for an opportunity to come to shoot Hamilton, only to quickly realize how foolish it was to do something so permanent. Just like Alex, history also had its eyes on Burr, and while Hamilton was definitely the more insufferable one of the two, it forever vilified Burr as the murderer of Alexander Hamilton. History doesn't care how you did it or why. All that matters is you did it. Upon like my 9th or something viewing, Hamilton is on its way to not only becoming one of my favorite films of all time, but also one of my favorite musicals, period. It's poetic in its presentation, speaks directly to and for everyone, and like the best historical pieces out there, reflects and casts a very heavy shadow on both our past and what's left of our future, further illustrating how the more things change, the more they stay the same. The fact that it's been 5 years since his Broadway debut and people are still dissecting his meetings, bobbing to the soundtrack, and falling in love with its influences, it shows how revolutionary this musical has become, and how it should set the standard for other musicals to come. It does play fast and loose with history, blame that on the musical and not the production, and some styles of music that dominate the score took a while for me to adjust to and understand, but for its entertainment value, emotional impact, and how well crafted it is as an overall whole, Hamilton is a real winner. But to be honest, as much as we deserve to give Lynn a good chunk of the credit for putting all this together, I think we should all be thanking Eliza for this.
People believe that this play is told through Eliza's eyes, not Hamilton's. This makes sense that the story is actually told through Eliza's eyes, because if you think about it, Eliza was the one that kept his legacy alive, you know? Hamilton died so young that if it wasn't for Eliza, nobody would have known who Hamilton was. That's the whole premise of who lives, who dies, who tells your story. Eliza told his story.
And if you consider that it's Lin-Manuel Miranda himself who leads Eliza off the stage and breaks the fourth wall, revealing all the people in the audience that her story actually has been told, and that her work was not in vain, yeah, that's pretty deep if you think about it. I think it goes without question that Hamilton is my favorite film of 2020. The mix of history and music, the meaningful and relevant lyrics, the brilliant performances, and the energy and heart it encompasses has to be revisited again and again and again. It needs to be seen to be believed. So I implore you, do not throw away your shot.